Welcome, everybody. My name is Amanda Hardigan. I'm Senior Director of Program Strategy and Culture for an organization called CFLeads. So we are a national organization, a network of community foundations. So first, thank you for welcoming us to Minnesota. We are not from here, but we're excited to be here and really talking about how to make some really global and national work local and especially relevant to your work happening here in Minnesota, which is the heart of a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals work. So I'm going to really quickly just introduce.
Are we going this way? There we go.
This is me. This is who we are. But we are here today. We're also hosting a deep dive tomorrow afternoon, which I think probably several of you are already signed up for, where we're going to have a working session to dive even more deeply. But right now, I'm excited to introduce Caroline Kleinfox, whose life work is the Sustainable Development Goals, and who is so wonderful to work with us right now as an independent consultant.
Thank you. I have a trick, so I'm going to pass this down so I don't create a sound wave here. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for joining us today. It's really exciting to see such a full room of folks interested in this conversation. My name's Caroline Kleinfox. I come from from outside of Washington, D.C. I am currently working as an independent consultant, but I've spent the past decade or so working in different roles, working on domestic implementation of the Global Sustainable Development Goals, which we'll get into in a moment here. And I'm just so excited to be here with you all. So today we're going to talk about exploring practical approaches to navigating complex challenges, namely frameworks for impact. To me, this means the tools that organizations use to organize their work around complex, interconnected challenges. These are systems that help connect the dots between different priorities. Sometimes these are strategic approaches you've developed for your own context, but there are also valuable established frameworks that can bring additional structure to your work from the outside. So some of these examples are the community leadership model, which we'll be talking about tomorrow, the welcoming standard, and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which is what I've spent a lot of my most recent years working on. So there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not going to say each of them, but you can see each on this screen. It's a global blueprint that covers everything from poverty and hunger to climate to partnerships. The idea is to bring forth the things that are common to all of us. This framework was developed over a period of 3 years through a global UN process, and it was adopted after that 3-year period by 193 countries. It was adopted in 2015 with the idea that all of these would be achieved by 2030. It was extremely ambitious, as we can all see. But the result of such a comprehensive consensus building that included stakeholders from all across the world is that it really is, to my view, a common language for common values. It has a lot of things in here, and they're not very controversial overall because they represent things that 193 countries think are important. Underpinning the 17 goals, there are 169 targets that outline what success looks like for each goal. And it's estimated that about 65% of those targets require local action in order to be achieved. So the SDGs are developed as a national framework, but for the national goals to be met, local action is required. It helps reveal connections between the topics we're working on locally to the national level once you dive in. So community foundations, you are already doing this work. This is just a tool to help organize, communicate, and measure what is already important to you and connect it to other organizations at different levels that are doing similar things or very different things, and you want something to connect between the two disparate topics. It helps us to make a supported case that housing, childcare, workforce together tackling that together is more effective than working on each in isolation, and that we don't have to start from scratch. So I'm really excited now to introduce 3 people who are doing the work right here in Minnesota, leaders who are making a difference both in their communities every day and they're employing interconnected strategies in order to do it. And I feel like every time I turn my head, I lose the mic, so I'm going to just Oh, no. No, I really do. Okay, so first we have Nataya Bauman, who's the CEO of Greater St. Cloud. You're leading inclusive economic development work across central Minnesota region. You have taken a career from startup manufacturing to academic research to regional economic development, and she also previously led Greater Fergus Falls and is passionate about entrepreneurship and downtown revitalization. Next, we have Mark Ritchie, who served as Minnesota's Secretary of State from 2007 to 2015, and more recently was the president of Global Minnesota. He wears many, many, many hats, along with your many SDG pins, and, including serving as the chair for the Minnesota Year of Water. And his work spans the full range of local to global engagement and really embodies the values of the SDGs. And finally, we have Jill Amundson, who is the Impact Evaluator at West Central Initiative, where she's been since 2018. She brings over 20 years of community development experience across West Central Minnesota, from grassroots projects to federally funded collaborations. She helps both West Central Initiative and its partners plan, measure progress, and share successes in community development. And I'm very excited now to turn to all of you. So we're going to start with the why. What problem are you solving? So let's start with having each of you share a bit about yourselves, your work, and what's keeping you up at night. What are the challenges your communities are facing that are driving you to do what you do? So, Nataya.
Great. All right. Well, small team of 5 people that operate under the direction of a 22-person board of directors. Together, we are guided by 3 strategic pillars. That is unifying regional leadership, supporting the life cycle of the business life cycle, rather, and then amplifying our region's return. And this is important to set this up because, the breadth and the depth of that work means that we also have to pull in other cross-cutting enablers, things like infrastructure and talent, the things that really help us strengthen coordination and reduce barriers to growth. So what is keeping me up at night is the fact that we have issues like housing and childcare, for instance, that were once part of community development. Now they're central to economic development because they are so significantly impacting workforce and business growth. And that's fine. We can take that on, but we still have the same number of people, right, doing all of this additional work. So for me, for our organization, the challenge becomes, how do we align our strategy while continuing to adapt to the evolving needs while being disciplined, right, with what we know and where we can actually create high impact. And so the challenge, what keeps me up, is really the capacity versus the compounding needs of the region.
Thank you. Jill, can we go to you next?
Thank you. I'm Jill Amundson. I'm the Impact Evaluator at West Central Initiative. We have 2 halves of our organization. So we're part community foundation for the 9-county region in West Central Minnesota. We're also the regional community development organization. So we have that federal designation to help with economic development. How far do you want me to go down the rabbit hole on SDGs right now? Maybe I'll just say what's keeping me up at night, right? Clean drinking water and the privatization of water. So I live in a very rural place, less than 500 people. About 80% of our communities haven't been investing in their critical infrastructure since probably the New Deal. When we had an event, we had talked about leaching landfills, for lack of a better word. And we also have large farms that are taking water for irrigation and for cattle it's coming right out of the groundwater supply. So just small things that really don't make a difference day to day, but have really long-lasting impacts. And I'll talk more about that as we dive into the SDGs.
All right, thank you.
Well, my name is Mark Ritchie, and I had the honor of serving some of you as your Secretary of State a few years ago. But before then, I spent almost all of my life working on the questions relate to rural America and family farms, working at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and responsible for trade policy and starting a nonprofit, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And in the course of doing that, more and more, I could see one dynamic, which was local communities or counties or regions would come up with a good idea. There was a problem. They would say, okay, here's a solution. Somebody wouldn't like that solution, and they would run down to the state capitol, and they would get something that would override that solution. Or a state would come up with a good idea and get going, and then somebody didn't like that idea, and they would run to Washington. And at some point, we noticed that Washington was doing some good things, and some people that didn't like that would go to these things called trade negotiations to get them overturned. You go, well, wait a minute. Do we have to become experts in international trade, trade policy, trade diplomacy? Oh, I guess we do. Oh, yeah, we have sister cities. Oh, yeah, we have international students. Oh, yeah, we have AFS. We have, our Rotary is international, and our Lions, maybe we can become those kind of participants. And suddenly, within that conversation, very smart people inside the UN system said, we need to have some goals that are global goals, not for this country or that country or whatever, but global goals. And a little later on, maybe I'll tell the funny story about how St. John's fits into this picture. But when I heard that there were sustainable development goals, and some of you know we were trying to bring a World Expo, it just suddenly all made sense that if every person on the planet could find one of those goals that fit what they were passionate about, they would have a way to be connected. And this last week I was up at a big mining conference up in Duluth, and I'm walking around, there's 120 some exhibitors, and a guy in a company, and I didn't know what it was, said, he pointed to my SDG pin and said, those are my values, come over and talk to me. And so if you can walk around a mining conference and have somebody eyeball this little pin and say, come over and talk to me, we're on to something.
I feel that. It's sort of a flag of, like, I know you a little bit already. So let's get into a little bit the interconnectedness of community development, because I talked a little bit about how the goals are meant to be interconnected. The idea is that you can't achieve one SDG without achieving multiple SDGs. They really are touching each other, and I know that that's very true at the local level. So Natalia, I heard some themes about workforce development, childcare, housing, equity. How do you think about the relationships between those different issues that you're working on? Do you tackle them separately or as a part of a bigger picture?
Well, we very intentionally do not tackle them separately because workforce doesn't exist without housing, right? And housing requires wages, and wages are driven by business growth. And at the center of all of that, it's all shaped by access, right? Whether it's transportation, childcare, opportunity to begin with. So they all are part of that very fragile ecosystem. And historically, GSE, that's Greater St. Cloud, we've not led in efforts around housing and childcare. We've always supported them. But because the business community has been so directly impacted by those particular areas, over the last few years, we've seen an increased demand to become more active in those areas. So, think about the employers that we have. Some of them may be in this room here. Centricare, for example, they're healthcare providers, not housing developers, but they are very actively engaging in those conversations and stepping up to the plate because they desperately need to find those solutions for their own workforce, and they know by rising boats, right, or rising tide lifts all boats. If they have more housing for their workforce, there will be more housing for others as well. And so because of this, GSC and I know other economic developers as well, we're being more intentional about how we show up in those spaces. How can we more effectively convene, align? How can we move those efforts forward, but still make sure that there's connections back to economic outcomes, right? Because if you solve one of those issues in a silo or in isolation, we're really just shifting that problem somewhere else. So we want to try to be collaborative as much as possible. And for us, as an economic development organization, our strategic plan aligns things like unified leadership and cross-cutting enablers like childcare and housing, because the challenges themselves don't really fit neatly into one box. So with a robust framework, this really enables us to be nimble when we need to be, and then we can still maintain the alignment with our strategy.
That makes a lot of sense. And Jill, as West Central Initiative's impact evaluator, you're trying to measure progress across, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but 82 cities?
Correct.
And many of them are under 1,000 people, is that right?
Most of them are. I think we have less than 10 that are over 1,000 people.
Wow. So some of them are struggling to keep schools open, and others are growing. So when you're trying to assess impact across communities with different needs, different cares, different geographic realities, how do you think about what to measure, and what helps you see, so what helps you see the bigger picture?
I think I will say that I've been very fortunate that we have the University of Minnesota as a partner, and I would urge any of you that are around tomorrow to sit in on that work session, because the work they're doing is amazing. How do I decide what to focus on? I think one of the privileges that we have in our role as that dual entity is we have one-on-one conversations with people on Main Street, and we have that regional overlook. So I grew up in a small town which is jokingly referred as 20 minutes to nowhere. Like, there's no reason you would be in that town unless you were going to that town. All of the shopping and commerce and most of the jobs existed in a city that was a half an hour to 45 minutes away. We have to think regionally, and that's very much greater Minnesota life. You live in kind of a 90-mile radius, so it's all of the things. So if we're addressing housing in a small community of Wendell, just south of Fergus Falls, that might have that might result in changes to the Fergus Falls available housing, childcare providers, all of those things. Sorry, my brain went down another rabbit hole. We initially started with the Sustainable Development Goals because we wanted to pair those two sides of our houses, and looking at the metrics that the Sustainable Development Goals gave us. You'd mentioned there's 169 targets. There's also 269 indicators. So for a data nerd like me, I'm all in, right? Give me the baseline data. I want to measure it. What we also found is that because it's got this international scale, we have indicators across the globe. We met with folks in Canada. We had folks go to Australia. We have some really fun partners in Hawaii. And the reason I'm saying this is that we have more in common than we do differences. And then we can look at the literal math of it all and find out if Maui, Hawaii, the island of Maui, is about the same size as West Central Minnesota. They also have tourism and agriculture are their common industries, so we have that in common. What are the things they're doing that are advancing those indicators and those targets that we can replicate in a similar way? Or in Winnipeg, Canada, we consider our neighbors to the north. What are they doing in a different government system where, by the way, their nonprofits have to fill out a census that is gorgeous. Love it. What are they doing in their system that we can then replicate? Okay, I'll give it over to someone else.
I love that. Now I need to go look up that census. And Mark, you have worked across local, regional, state, and as you said, global levels. So what value do you see the SDG framework offering to communities? And can you give us one example for now from Minnesota that embodies this?
So there was some of you were from this region, but you know that At St. John's, they each year have a very, very big peace speech. It's a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and they come and they spend the day. And so the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Colombia came, and he gave a fantastic speech about his getting the Peace Prize and connecting and changing the direction of a 50-year civil war. And the first question out of the student body over here in St. John's was, hey, we've heard that you were the person who signed off on and made the SDGs happen. How did that happen? So he was a little blown away that he came up here to make a speech about the FARC and, and all of that. And the first question from the student was about, hey, how'd you help? And he told this amazing story of these two incredible women inside the UN system who were part of his foreign ministry, who said, look, we've had some other goals in the past, and they were, millennial goals, and they were kind of pointing at the third world and saying, you should do this and you should do that. No, they decided that we needed real global goals that everybody could connect with. And they took that idea to the world, and then they took that idea to their boss, who really was in charge of this at the UN, and he signed off, and then they went and sold this idea. And why that story was important, and I just thought it was the coolest thing, and I asked him, did you ever imagine you were going to be hit up about the SDGs coming up here to, he said no. But he was very happy that it was recorded, and, public radio was there so he could have it, because that story tells us something about our interconnectedness. I have to say that I was trying to get an expo going, and somebody said, well, if you're going to do it on health, you should get the SDGs. And I said, well, explain how that would work. He said, well, just sit down and read them. And so I'm reading along SDGs, and there's SDG 3, good health and well-being for all at all ages. Okay. And then there's a whole bunch of indicators. And SDG 3.6 is reduction in deaths and injuries from car crashes by half by 2030. And if any of your lives have been touched by a car crash, yourself or your loved one or your daughter or whatever, there's something about somebody saying out loud, as a planet and as a resident of Minneapolis, we're going to work to eliminate half of those deaths and injuries by 2030 and get the momentum to eliminate them. Then it just grabbed my heart and drug me in. And I've been a proponent of the 17, actually now people talk about 18 because they want to talk about unexploded ordnances and landmines. But because it was so universal and specific, those are the things that any kind of work in development need them both. It needs to be, everybody needs drinking water. And everybody needs the opportunity to say, how can we use partnerships, which is in fact the 17th. 16 of them are actual goals, and the 17th says partnerships is how we want to do this. That is exactly how in a rural community, as you described it, but every place, we've had a few months of every neighbor protecting every neighbor and their kids. And so it's not just rural, and it's not only the city. It's everybody taking care of everybody, and the SDGs are an exact and public way to do that. And just to brag on Fergus Falls, which I like to do 4 or 5 times a day, if you don't mind, their almanac about their town has some parts of the story of how Fergus brought the SDGs into the work, and also just how Fergus connects with its own community and the broader community. Thank you, and I understand you were the Economic Development Director of Fergus. Thank you as well.
I just want to say, how cool is it that the former Secretary of State is holding something that I had a little bit of something to do with?
Al, if you want to ask me, I carry boxes.
Do you do autographs?
Oh, hey, you got to do autographs.
Nobody wants that.
Tell the kids. We'll get a picture. Okay, stop it. Okay.
I hear a lot of themes coming through, and one of the things Mark just mentioned was about youth, and also I think about sort of the passion that finding something you care about identified in this kind of global language that you can take action on in your community, I think is extremely inspiring to all of us, and particularly I've seen inspiring to young people. And young people are starting to come to their colleges and say, you're teaching me about the SDGs, but are you reporting on them? What are we doing about them? And I think we're seeing more and more, and we'll continue to see that as the folks who have grown up with this as their lexicon come into power. And I'm really excited to see what they do, having learned about this type of framework for a long time. So we've talked about kind of the why and what's keeping us up at night. We've gone through a little bit of how our work is intersectional and interconnected. And so now, so what, right? How are we using this framework, and where is it getting us? So, Natalia, I know that you work across 3 counties, I believe, here in Greater St. Cloud, and you're coordinating with cities as well, around and economic development organizations, schools, healthcare systems, et cetera. So you have a lot of different actors with their own priorities, many of whom are probably not trained on a common framework as to what you're using. So I'm curious, do you have an example of a challenge where you actually got people kind of rowing in the same direction around this interconnected? I think you've given us one, but perhaps another. And what made that work, and when it could have easily stayed in those silos you're talking about?
Well, Mark ended on the importance of partnerships, and I think the example here will continue to prove that point. And very recent for us here is how we addressed confusion and fragmentation here in our own ecosystem. So in our region, we are very fortunate to have many providers, right? We have city and county and regional economic development. We have many chambers. We have many neighborhood organizations like the Downtown Alliance. And so they're all really strong organizations doing great work. But we have been consistently hearing from the business community, things like, well, aren't you all the same? Or, who do I go to and when and for what, right? There were just too many options, and so it was overwhelming for people, and then they just said, we're not gonna bother, right? And so, in reality, from our perspective, it was really strong work that we were doing, but from the outside, it seemed very siloed. So to solve that, GSC partnered with the City of St. Cloud Economic Development, the regional chamber here, and then the St. Cloud Downtown Alliance to start a regional partners tour. So together, we actually walk through our respective mission, vision, values, and then we dive deeper. How are we different? How are we similar? Where do we overlap? And ultimately, how do we actively collaborate for regional success? And then we expanded that, right? It wasn't just to cities and counties and our boards and our investors and our members. Now it's cross-sector. We go to healthcare providers, manufacturers, other nonprofit partners, service clubs like the Rotary. And the goal there is really broad awareness and shared understanding throughout the entire ecosystem. And, now that we have that in place, because I work across 3 counties, we have this really robust framework. And now if I want to collaborate with and share this in Benton County, I can go to Benton Economic Partnership in the city of Foley and do the same thing to make sure that that message is coming across. And the reason that I think that this works is because we all aligned around a shared outcome, right? In this case, it was regional prosperity. And then we committed to consistent messaging. Over time, that has built trust, it's reduced confusion, and I think generally it equips others with the ability to navigate and share that system more effectively. At the end of the day, we all say, hey, there's all these tools in the toolbox, right? But when we talk about rowing in the same direction, we are rowing in the same direction. All of our organizations are just using different oars, right? And so when we put that all together, I think it's definitely been more effective. And it's still something that is ongoing, so.
That's awesome. Jill, we've heard a little bit about your almanac now, which I know everyone's going to be looking at soon. But you also just completed West Central Initiative's first voluntary local review. So for the SDGs, there's a voluntary reporting mechanism at the national level. Nothing about kind of acting on them or reporting on them is mandatory. This is a voluntary structure. So at the national level, you do a progress report assessing how you're doing on the goals, and then you submit it to the United Nations. And so what happened is a few years into the SDGs, New York City launched a voluntary local review, which kind of began a global movement of localized reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals, which you can share with local partners and also at the UN. So you just completed your first for West Central Initiative, which is super exciting. And it's also really unusual for a regional organization to do this, particularly in the United States, where the SDGs are not necessarily a widespread common language at this time. So why did you decide to do the report, and how has using the framework to assess progress affected the way you see your region after going through that progress?
So the short answer to why did I do it was because my boss told me to. But she, in all seriousness, our president Anna Wasesha is such a forward thinker that I just said yes and then figured out why she wanted me to do it later. But the Almanac and the VLR were started at the same time, and it really was revolved around the question of who cares and why. At the start of our exploration into the Sustainable Development Goals, we brought our Economic Development District Board to a meeting. We had them all sit down. I'm not going to lie, lots of grumpy older men because they were county commissioners. And I was terrified. I was honestly quite frightened of what was going to happen when we introduced this rather controversial topic of the United Nations, which who knew? But if you get community members around a table and you ask them what good things are happening in your community, my goodness, do their faces light up. And so they shared Post-it note upon Post-it note of all of these wonderful things that were happening. And Anna said, how do we tell this story? How do we share all of these good deeds, all of these measurements we've been working hard to kind of back up the story? And so the Almanac is, I'll say, the fun, the stories, the heartfelt, the emotion. From that, we then extracted all of the really boring data pieces, so if people like me could jump down the rabbit hole separately into our voluntary local review. And that is a reflection of our dashboard, which you can learn about later tomorrow, or jump on our website at wcif.org. We have the Sustainable Development Dashboard. And then the VLR really connects all of those pieces together. So you can look at our comprehensive economic development strategy. You can look at articles from the Almanac. You can look at our climate action plan that we were able to get privately funded for the region. And then just really dive in. If you care about one thing, if you care about clean water, housing, if you care about that your neighbor can't access nutritional food, it's all in there. And then we can tie in the next piece, which is you can actually do something about that. I don't need to tell any of you this. Community foundations are doing all of the good work. You hear all of the things. This is just a menu to say, like, here's more information. See how you fit. See how what you can do tomorrow for your neighbor fits into this global framework.
Yeah, and I hear from both of you about how this is just using these frameworks is how you talk about what you're already doing in a way that is relatable. And we're going to talk more about that tomorrow for anyone who's coming to the workshop, but we're not going to go farther now. But I think it's a really important point of it's not an additional thing that you have to do on top of your already overloaded plate. It's something that can help inform alignment with others and identify new partners that may be somewhat unexpected. So Mark, you've convened people around everything from global trade policy, as you mentioned, to the Year of Water, to the SDGs in those wonderful lunch roundtables you used to hold. So when you're bringing diverse stakeholders together around complex challenges, what makes an organizing framework useful versus just adding more complexity to things that folks are already working on, as we just said?
Well, I think for just speaking personally, but you know, I retired after 2 terms of Secretary of State because I promised my wife I would, and then I was retired, And then I got recruited in to do something else over COVID, and that was to be president at Global Minnesota, which was like heaven. You know, a 75-year-old organization that was committed to connecting Minnesota to the world and the world to Minnesota. Hard to beat that. But the SDGs did need further expansion, and so within that context, we started up a quarterly SDG roundtable. We had founders, the folks who started, we had people in. And the thing that was important about it was that in the beginning, it was kind of getting people thinking about the SDGs, but I have seen it evolve at Global Minnesota, where I've retired again, but around very specific topics that then bring in, I'm interested in water. And so, you know, all these, the SDG Roundtable at Global Minnesota just a month or so ago was on water. And to answer your specific question, I can see in participation, sometimes I'm in person and sometimes, you know, web, is that if you have a topic that people say, oh, I'm interested in that topic, then the SDGs allow for different people to present and say, this is how we came to this. Climate is another example. Healthcare is another example. You have one danger. Some of us are, what was that? Deliriously optimistic. And some of us are in unstoppable rabbit hole chasers, just to be frank. And so having water, for instance, which actually has two. One, it has about water as we think of it in terms of the concept of groundwater and under the oceans and that. And then water, WASH, is kind of shorthand, clean water, sanitation, et cetera. It allows the person's interests, car crashes, whatever, to then be plugged into a broader interest, and then you're meeting. Because that other person, if you connect, then you will find out all kinds of things that you didn't know. I don't think you've said it yet, but one of the things that Fergus did was to take half of their board and half of their staff, I think, to a meeting of Community Foundations of Canada, which was all on the SDGs, and learned about this project that they were doing about geopositioning things in their regions that had, you know, one of the 17. And they came back, and I think it's very important that the board, county commissioners, city council, that kind of thing, and staff came back and then had a really clear project, which was pinpointing. And if I remember right, it's been a few years, one of the most important things was it showed the places where there weren't things happening, as in addition to saying, oh, we got lots of people working on A, B, and C, but on D, E, and F. So that kind of thing then also gave the, let's say, the minor nerds some data, which then is all they need, because, you know, they got to go home, cook dinner, and, you know, that kind of thing. And so, so it made it possible for it to seem like the regular thing that people would do. And so, Year of Water, next year, January 1, think about jumping in a lake or, you know, whatever you want to do. But the point is that what the SDGs demonstrated was that people could bring their interests and then connect together and then build out. Your interest in water, about drinking water. Last week there was a decision that one of the biggest things we could do in Year of Water is to get the whole state to say out loud, we've recognized that our drinking water infrastructure is our biggest single problem without money to fix and repair on time. It will cost more each year. We postponed. We need to put on the ballot the creation of a fund for communities and others to be able to build that out. And as a state, we've said we want to protect our history. As a state, we've said we want to protect our environment. As a state, we've said we want to protect our heritage and culture. And a Year of Water to celebrate all kinds of things, you know, like we all want to do, also then provides the opportunity to say out loud, hey, and some of you might remember when we put transportation on the ballot, we got a chance for all of us to say yes to something that, yes, it's important for all of us, but it's really important for those little earthlings that we're turning this place over to. We've made some messes. We're going to turn those over to. We're going to have a chance through your water and doing something big about the question of infrastructure that we can look with a kind of a clear conscience. This is important and it's for the future. And that's an example of just saying, we can make something really positive, give people that kind of lift. I just say we could use some more of those kind of positive things to get us going.
Well, I could ask you all questions for days, I think, but I'd like to open the floor up and see if there's anyone in the room with questions.
Or ideas.
I love that.
I'll use my outside voice. So one of the things that I've learned, and Mark and I have been in many...
Hold it.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Scott Cole from the Twin Cities. Collectivity is the company I work for, and Mark and I have been in many SDG roundtable conversations together. And one of the things that I've heard from people in my circle is that sometimes the language of SDGs is really complex. And so I'm curious what you all have done, particularly in West Central Minnesota, to make it easier for people to gravitate toward the SDGs. And I've heard of something called the Good Life Goals that are kind of like a simplified version of the 17 SDGs and turned it into more lay language than the more scientific-oriented language. Any ideas around that?
I have not heard of the lay language. What was the? Good life goals. I'm going to look that up when I get home. Yeah, we've done a lot of translating. And I'm not just saying like, you say that websites should be for a 5th grade reading level. I mean, we held a 17 rooms event with the Brookings Institute as our guiding party. And we even had room leaders, like when we were talking about sustainable development goals, and here's the targets that are under your goal for your room. They would look at me and they're like, I don't know what this is. What do you want me to talk about? And so one of the first things I did was take the targets for each goal and write them as though I were going to read it off a prompter, large print, very clear and concise, so that it was just the start of the conversation. If you want to get to this goal, so the iconography is amazing, by the way, if you're an art nerd. If you want to get down to no poverty, what does that mean? Well, of course, it means something different in West Central Minnesota than it might in a third world country. But literally, what does no poverty mean? That people can pay for shelter. I don't have the indicators in front of me, obviously. But it's digging down to that level of base knowledge and the respect for that everyone in the room is the expert. We just all have to speak the same language first. Our VLR and the almanac is just really astounds me that he has this. This came with stickers, not because we were being irreverent, but because we want this to be accessible, and we want the stories to be accessible. We want all of those things. We want people to understand, because I do come from a town where we say, that would tell me we don't have homeless people in our community. This is how I started my job in community action. We don't have homeless people. Yeah, you do, you just don't see them. We don't have people who are hungry. Yeah, you have kids that are only eating at school. When they go home, there isn't food there. That's happening. So it's really, and one of the reasons I love the Sustainable Development Goals is the big block picture. So if we can get more language that's that base level of, no, really, we all want this, I think the better off we'll all be. Speaking of Pollyannaism, that's me. Do you have more?
I can't be that Pollyanna. I mean, we got to stack it up here.
I can add too. The SDGs are talked about as a blueprint for the world's future. So if you take that analogy and you say, well, a blueprint that was designed for countries is not necessarily going to fit us in a state level or at a town. But just like you could take, a community level drawing and bring it local and redraw it, you can do the same thing with the SDGs. So if you take the frame of the 17 goals, they mean something to every community. Then there's lots of tools now that have been developed, and we'll talk through some of that tomorrow, of how you can connect it and use your own language, and then go out to a trade conference and somewhere else in the world, take your young people and have them speak about their local stuff in these global terms, because it's kind of creating that roadmap for connection across place. That's the hope.
So one thing that I think is important as I think about this, I love this, by the way, thank you for sharing this, is to also have stories to go with it. Is that as a former legislator who served with the Secretary of State at the same time, when we wanted to pass something, or if you looked at a budget sheet, you could say, well, we're cutting $5 million, it's in the big picture. But when we started saying, what was that $5 million funding? Or if you talk about childhood poverty and you can talk about a parent that you met or a child or in school or whatever, with clean water, Woodbury, we had, all the, PFCs. I learned more about chemicals than I would ever learn. That was really, really powerful. When I found out about it very early on, no one they didn't know what to do about it. And I looked across the street at the kids. I get teared up when I talk about this. I looked at these kids at the bus stop and thought, I can decide if I'm going to drink my water today. And even though it was safe, they don't know. And that was what really got people when we said to state officials, we all know this is just a matter of 3 or 4 days, but we should let everybody know. So that transparency. So I think that when you have these goals, if you can come up with people in your community so it's real, that makes a really big difference.
Absolutely.
I just am so excited to hear about this and seeing a global model being used locally. I worked for 10 years with the U.S. Agency for International Development, and Mark worked with your niece last year to defend USAID, and it's dismantling. So I just think it's a great way in our space that is ever becoming more nationalist, for us to recognize that we are in an interconnected world, and that these global models created in Colombia, didn't know that, so thanks for that, can be used here in the United States in small towns. So what a really cool way for Minnesota and small Minnesota towns to be a leader in our nation at a time where our president is pulling out of 31 UN agencies. So very cool, and I'm hoping that you guys become a model for other cities. I'm putting it as a note for myself to go back to a few cities that I work in, to talk about that. So just wanted to say thanks.
I'm always good for a question. Amy Trombley with Initiative Foundation. I'm guessing that many communities that are in here have some sort of community framework of sorts. So it doesn't mean we need to shift to this, international SBG to really still catalyze around something, depending on whatever that framework is. So thinking about that, thinking about collaboration, what's just one strategy you either would or would not encourage us to do based on your learned experiences to bring communities together around a shared framework? What's one strategy we as foundations and supporters of this work can go back and bring to our school or to our communities?
Well, I think it's smart that in any time that you're implementing a new framework or, introducing a new initiative, that, it's not copy and pasted, right? Just because it works really well in West Central or in Fergus Falls doesn't mean it's going to work exactly that way here in St. Cloud. I've learned that firsthand. You have to look at the nuance of that community and that region and have that framework, but again, be nimble and allow yourself to adapt to meet the needs of that particular region and allow those members of that community to come in and join that by creating buy-in, right? So that's what I would say is just don't make it copy and paste. Allow yourself to adapt.
I really appreciate your question because it's kind of got my mind spinning, and it's got me spinning on two things. One of is some of you may work in transportation or public safety, but you may know Towards Zero Deaths, TZD, and the TZD conferences that I used to go to as Secretary of State and spokesperson for MAD and some other things. There would be like 1,000 people there, Towards Zero Death. And if I remember right, this was somehow adapted from Sweden or someplace, something real Minnesotan. And that is maybe an example of something that is moving in a kind of direction of a framework towards zero, education, enforcement, emergency services, and something about engineering. In other words, there is a model here in our state that maybe a little dive into would give us some, and I see enough people nodding that you maybe have touched that. But I have to say, and I brought it up, but you kind of started it, which is if we're all going to have well, let me just say this. I now live in a three-generation household, and there's a 3-year-old and a competitor on the way, and I got that letter from the city that said maybe the pipe from our house out to the thing might have lead, and I go on, I just I'm 75, and I go, wait a minute, there's a 3-year-old here. What is that? Check that. Let's get that fixed. Wait a minute. And so as I'm being like a kind of a nut about this, Dean Erdahl called me, and he and I were co-chairs of the Civil War commemorations, 6 or 7 years. He was a Republican, I was a Democrat. We did all kinds of stuff. He said, Mark, I'm lobbying for little tiny towns, 50. I'm taking in, and he did this, he took in a box of Kleenex for each of the legislators, and then he had the town testify about their Dean, it's a mean thing to do, but it was brilliant. And he said, Mark, we've got to create a dedicated fund so we stop screwing around with this, and we got to get it done soon. And how are we going to do it? And are you going to help me do this? And so he basically laid out to me an example, which is, okay, drinking water. Lots of people do have their own wells. This is a very important thing. But a whole lot of people have public water, and that infrastructure has to be maintained, fixed, expanded, whatever. We have to do it with dedicated money. It cannot just come by just sliding here and there. We've got to do this. So in my mind, like a kind of gatherings that said to towns, let's talk about how, not for long, but let's talk about the problem. It's a huge number. And then here's the solution. We need the legislature to do this and the governor to do that. We got to put this on the ballot. Then we got to get out there like we did with transportation and history and all this. We got to get this done, and we got to get this done in the next year. And I think that's actually something that Dean Erdahl is a pretty darn determined guy. And I think he's kind of got me already lined up. So I think Year of Water can have a big thing like this that is really, and we can't forget people with their own wells. That's going to be important. But this kind of thing is an example of how we might do this. And Apple Valley needs some giant amount of money because of PFAS. And Ashby probably could use some money. Yeah.
About 5 million, by the way. That's how much Ashby needs. I talked to the city clerk yesterday.
There we go. So we got to start.
But that is one conversation that I think it's maybe skirting your question, so I apologize. But one strategy that I would highly recommend is show up. Show up at your city council meetings. Figure out why other people aren't at your city council meetings. We learned during COVID that there was no one in attendance. And yet when I would go into a town and talk to them, they would say, like, those people at City Hall, do you understand those people are actually our people? Your vote determines those things. But you have to show up and you have to have those conversations. And if it's not a welcoming place, make it welcoming. You have that power. And as the leaders of your community, whether that's formalized leadership or informal leadership, it's one of the most important things as an American you can do is make civic participation possible for everyone. That's my soapbox for the day. And I also want to say, if you haven't looked, there is a lead service line inventory. I know. So you can see all across the state, all the places there's still lead piping. And if anyone has done any research, because I have, surprise, surprise, what lead will do to a child is, in most cases, irreparable harm. And that affects society as a whole, too.
It's interesting how what we can do to our infants and children is, in fact, what we will do for all of humanity. And the sooner we take that as our North Star, the better.
So I recognize we're now just minutes away, keeping folks from, we're between you and the happy hour situation. So with that in mind, just one final lightning round. What's one thing people could do tomorrow that doesn't require a big lift, but starts moving them towards an applied framework approach or new SDG knowledge?
Yeah, I always like to start by asking different questions, right? Don't ask your team, what do we need to do? Ask what needs to change, what problem are we trying to solve, and who needs to be at the table. That's a great place to start.
Well, in terms of tomorrow, coming to our 2 o'clock session to talk specifics is what I would recommend. And vitamin E in the morning, but...
And I would just say that act hyper locally. Be focus on what on your street you can change, what in your neighborhood you can change, because that does have global impacts. Feeding your neighbor is the best. What's that adage? It's the best way to store your food is in the belly of your neighbor.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
You can skip that one. We'll do it after. Thank you, everybody, and thank you again to our panelists. Thanks for the plugs, Mark, for tomorrow. So very much, if you haven't registered for that, you're still able to. We're also able to provide some travel stipends for folks if it means you're staying later, things like that. So very much welcome that. We threw up some other things that CFLeads is doing in the next few months. The Economic Mobility Summit is a 2-day event in Fort Worth. Civic Health Summit is also coming up, so I love the quote that you just ended with about the best thing you can do as an American is to ensure civic participation for everyone. We have our Civic Health Summit coming up in September, TBD on the location, but I hope that you all can come. If you want to learn about any of these things, you can find me during the conference or just go on our website. Thank you, though.